This is a review of The Puppy War for the people who have either read the cover text or read the Kindle sample and aren't sure whether they should buy it or not. This video will contain minor spoilers. They are spoilers curated through the filter of these are the spoilers I would have liked to have heard before I read the story, because that would have made it more enjoyable for me. After reading the sample of this book, I was very much on the fence, but I ended up buying it because so many people have spoken well of this book. But I was frustrated for much of the book until finally things really started to pick up. And these are spoilers that I would have liked for someone to have told me, because that would have kept me reading and would have helped me enjoy things. So these aren't going to be major spoilers that totally give away the plot, but they are going to be minor spoilers that might pique your interest. My ultimate goal of this video is to tell you that The Puppy War is worth reading, so if that's all that you need, just shut down the video and go read the book, but if you need some more, please stay tuned. A quick summary of the book blurb is that this girl, Rin, basically is very poorly off in society. She studies for something called the Keiju exam and then does very well enough to get into a very prestigious academy. However, when she gets to the academy, people don't really like her. She's poor and she has a different skin color, which brings about a lot of prejudice and a lot of oppression of her, and she has to deal with this. But throughout the story, she excels at this school and eventually pledges to a very rare specialty on this academy that brings her into touch with shamanism and some old powers that haven't been used for a very long time. This story is really about shamanism, addiction, and power lust. It's not a school fantasy as it at first seems when you've read the cover text. It's so much more. It's about searching for an identity and a home in a world that scorns you and that hates you and that doesn't give you many breaks. It's about creating your own breaks, but also how you might make things worse with your reactions. This is the sort of book that has a sort of meh beginning and a cool middle and then a really awesome ending. The great thing about books like that is that when you've read them, everything becomes better about them. The beginning becomes more tolerable, even if it was meh. It's just nicer to have read. The bad thing is that these books are less likely to get finished than books that start strong but end weak. And that's why I'm making this video, because I think it's too bad if you end up not reading this book because you don't like the beginning. So let's get to it. Let's talk about why you should give this a chance. First off, this is not a school fantasy. The author herself has made a comment on Goodreads that I found very helpful. It definitely helped me keep reading while I was going through the book. She has stated that this is not a school fantasy. Yes, we spend a lot of time at this war academy, but basically we move away from that setting pretty quickly and then the real story starts. I disagree on the really quickly, because it's about the halfway mark that we actually leave the school and the real plot begins, but stay with me. This book has a very long cover text if you go on Goodreads and read it, and there's a reason for that. It actually covers almost the entire plot up until the halfway point. This is typically a red flag because it means that the story doesn't really know how to start, and we'll get to that. But it basically is because the true story doesn't start until the middle of the story. And at the same time, the author really wants to get to that point, but they need to build all of this stuff up. They need to build up the world and the characters and the conflicts before really setting things off. That leads to the writer using a very summarizing style at the beginning of the story, which I found very hard to connect with. I felt like all the characters were sort of just that you were told how they were instead of actually experiencing them. And I felt a lot of the time that I was very disconnected to Rin, whereas later I became more well connected to her. However, we need that beginning in order to understand all of the other stuff. Usually, like if I was a beta reader on this, I would have been so easy to say, why don't you just cut out all of that beginning? But you actually do need that school time in order to really appreciate what happens when it ends. The themes in this story are power lust, a need for security, addiction, loss of culture and suppression of people. It's a search for belonging, it's destruction, and all of these key points need to be built up. You need to understand the character and where they come from. The problem is that because of this summarizing style, a lot of things seem to only matter in hindsight. So something happens later with different characters where you're like, damn, okay, now everything in retrospect makes so much more sense. But the problem is that that impact would have been stronger if I had really connected with the characters. And the fact that you needed that much story beforehand, that many words, to not manage to really connect me to the characters and then have this one moment that really connected me with them, that really hints that you have an ineffective storytelling early on. And I do think that is the great weakness of the story. The first 33% are where it really annoyed me, and then something happens at the 33% mark that really sets the story in motion. And I know, that sounds like a lot, and you don't want to read 33% of such a large book without really enjoying it, but maybe you will enjoy it. Maybe you're not as tired of school fantasy tropes as I was. The problem is with this summarizing style is that the author really ends up leaning into tropes and leaning into things we've seen before, and where I felt that here it wasn't really justified. Like, you have a rival, you have a best friend, you have some girl issues, and it just didn't really connect with me, and it didn't really feel very true. But again, it felt very powerful in hindsight once later things happened. Still, I only really connected with about 3 characters. So I do think that the character gallery is the weakest point of this story. There are a few very strong characters, but the characters around them are very much summarized, very much you're told how they are, but you don't really get to experience them, and they don't feel like fully fleshed out characters. And yet you're told that the main character cares about them and you should care about them, and I just don't really. However, the thing that really carries this story and really made it worth for me to read were those few characters that I really cared about. And it was this theme of power lust, addiction, this need to rise from the ashes, which is actually a very good metaphor since there's this phoenix power present in this story. So let's talk about the main character, because really she's the one who carries the book. I really liked her at the start. The beginning of the sample really caught my attention because the whole thing with the KGUE exam is that Rin is very driven. But once she gets into the academy and goes to the academy, it feels kind of meandering. When you have a school fantasy, you have the structure. They have to go to classes, they have to go to exams, and you have these social things that are part of school life, but it didn't really feel like Rin was so driven anymore. It didn't feel like she had an ultimate goal, but that's because her ultimate goal of getting into this school was to not get married and to survive. She didn't want to get sold off. So really it makes sense that she kind of loses herself in this period and later have to find herself. And that's what happens at the 33% mark. So watch out for that. And I think when you understand this, you can better appreciate her floundering and searching for a purpose, because suddenly it feels very realistic when you think about it this way. At the 33% mark, things really picked up and Rin started to become very driven, and I really loved that part. Then something happens later where in the middle, Rin again, her world changes and she again doesn't really have a goal of her own, and we're back to that floundering, but the things around her and the characters around her are so interesting that it's actually okay. Then at the 80% mark of the story, things really explode. I'm not sure, these are numbers that I think it was around there because I was reading on my Kindle, but it could be 82%, whatever. But things really explode and the ending is just phenomenal. I've seen people in Goodreads write like, what did I just read? And that's really the feeling that I had at the end of the story. I just started to read the second book, and I'm very excited to see where things are going because I actually don't really have any idea. And I think that marks the beginning of a great second book, because in a trilogy you have the first book, which is sort of the opening, but then the second book is the middle act, and this is where the chips are in the air and you don't know where they're gonna fall. And the third book is when the chips, you can sort of see where the chips will land. So I really usually love the second book, and I think I hope that this is going to be a great second book. So I hope this book might have given you a little bit more perspective on what you're getting into if you're reading The Puppy War. It has some structural issues, it has some pacing issues, but ultimately it's an interesting world. It's very much inspired by the Chinese history of around the Japanese occupation of China, which is an interesting part of history and also a very horrifying part of history, which this book paints very well and very dramatically and very horrifyingly, and I appreciated that a lot. So just for that, it's very interesting, but it does have some very powerful characters and some very powerful plot points on the way. So I hope that you will bear with these weaknesses that the story has and really appreciate its strengths and appreciate its main character, because I think she really grows on you. She's not the kind of character that you love for the person that she is, because she has her issues, but that's kind of the great thing about her. She's interesting to follow, and I think those main characters are way greater and they make way greater protagonists. That's just my opinion. So stay tuned if you want to hear me talk about more stories and what I'm reading and what I think about different storytelling techniques. And like, share, subscribe, all that bling, and see you next time.